In previous weeks, we talked about study design. I introduced you about cohort study, and you reviewed the slides about case control study. So what is cohort study? I'll review very briefly. And the purpose of this lecture, I will introduce you the statistics, what appropriate statistics generated from this type of study design. So cohort study is you have a group of people and that has an exposure and follow them over time, and you see the outcome, the disease. So it's a prospective. And the case control study is at this point you have a population already have disease. So you identify the cases and controls and trace back over time, retrospectively, try to find the exposure. So what kind of statistics were generated from this? And remember this 2x2 table. And we have two groups exposed and two groups with disease. So the AUD means alcohol use disorders, with one group has 89 of them and no symptoms. We have 1,411. So total of the study sample is 1,500. So using that table as an example and see how applied to a cohort study. So we have 500 exposed, and we're going to generate relative risk. Relative risk is a ratio of the incidence rate of the exposed, unexposed. So remember, we have 500 person in the exposed group, and 57 develop alcohol use disorder over time. And the other group is the unexposed group, have 1,000 people, and 32 develop alcohol use disorder. And so what's the instance for the exposed? Is 57 over 500. What's the incidence rate for unexposed group? Is 32 over 1,000. So relative risk is very clear, right? Now I'm going to introduce you what is relative risk. And in previous slides, we have the exposed and unexposed. So we generate the risk for the exposed is 0.114, and the risk of the unexposed is 32 over 1,000 is 0.032. So this figure on the right try to illustrate the risk of the exposed at 1.114. So when we're looking at this way, the absolute risk is the risk of exposed minus the risk of unexposed. So the difference between those two groups is 0.082, and the top portion of that bar. Then what is the relative risk? So the risk of exposure versus the risk of unexposure. So that's a different ways to calculate it. And I'm just trying to illustrate it more visually here. So it's 1.114 divided by 0.023. So it's 3.56. So what that means? That means the people in the exposed group, for example, to certain risk factors, are 3.56 more likely to develop AUD, alcohol use disorder, compared to those who are not exposed. So you can switch around, it's the same meaning. Just remember the concept. It's not the table, the column, or the row. It's really what the exposed or unexposed mean. So if you understand the concept, you will know how to calculate the relative risks, no matter how the 2x2 table is structured. So come back to looking at the case control study. Case control study is we know the cases. We know the people already developed the disease. Now we try to identify exposure. So we have a total population of 1,500. So we have 89 cases in this population developed alcohol use disorder. We did a chart review. We find out 57 of them exposed to a risk factor, and 32 didn't. And in the control group, and there are 443 exposed to that certain risk factors, and the remaining didn't. So what is odds? Odds is of the exposed in the cases is 57 over the unexposed. And what is the odds for the control? Is exposed over the unexposed. So if you can visually decompose the table, you will know how to construct the odds ratio. Is the odds of the exposed in the cases versus the odds of the exposed among the controls. So how do we interpret? The odds ratio of being exposed in the AUD cases are 3.93 times more than the odds being exposed in those who don't have the symptoms. There's a little rule of thumb in epidemiology. If the odds ratio equals to 1, that means the exposure is not related to the disease. And if the odds ratio larger than 1, the exposure is positively related disease. And if it's less than 1, the exposure is negatively related to disease. These two concepts sometimes can be very confusing. That's why I want to introduce those two concepts together by looking at the study design. So remember, where is exposure? How do you know the exposure, and when do you know the outcome? So case control study and the cohort study. And cohort, think about prospectively, you are looking at the incidence. So that means relative risks you're looking. And for odds ratio, you are trying to find the exposure, if that exposure is in the cases or is not.